Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition podcast, sponsored by the University of Chicago, Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship at Chicago Booth. I'm Brian O'Connor, Adjunct Professor of Entrepreneurship at Chicago Booth, and joining me today is Dennis Chookasian. Dennis is an Adjunct Professor at Chicago Booth as well. He is the former Chairman and CEO of CNA Insurance. He also has CEO and operating experience in a small company setting at Empower, where he led that business from 35 employees to over 300 at the time of his ultimate involvement in that business. Additionally, Dennis has served as director and chairman of 13 publicly traded companies and 50 companies that are privately held. Dennis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be here.
Before we get started, I think I try to give your background a little bit of justice, but if you could share a little bit of additional insight into your story and how you came to be involved in this world of entrepreneurship through acquisition and working with young and first-time CEOs.
Sure. My background is a pretty technical background. I was a chemical engineer at Northwestern, and then I went and did my MBA at Booth and Master's in Economics, London School of Economics. And then when I completed that, went to work for what is now Deloitte, Touche Ross at the time, doing consulting for 8 years. And at that time, about half my work was in technical systems work, computer programming, and the other half was in finance and accounting. So a very different kind of environment in consulting. At that time, in consulting, you didn't specialize the way you do today. So that gave me a very broad-based background in many different topics. As a result of that, I was then hired at CNA to be the CFO and CIO, running both systems and finance, which is pretty unusual today, but at the time, it was possible to do both those jobs. Today, again, because of specialization, hard to do. I was at CNA for 15 years as CFO, and then a CFO CIO, and then I became the CEO President Chairman CEO for 9 years, and then served in the board for 3 years after I stepped down as CEO. And then finally, I'm in my third career, serving as an adjunct professor at Booth, and then also teaching at 2 universities in China and 1 in India, and then I serve on boards. As you mentioned, I've been on a lot of boards, and I'm presently on 5 public boards and 20 private company boards. The private company boards are boards that are sponsored generally by private equity firms. 1 or 2 of them are smaller investment groups.
5 publicly traded boards, 20 privately held boards. How do you find time to manage all of those various commitments and obligations?
Well, first, sleep is highly overrated. So it's obviously you have to be pretty well organized. And just as a person, I'm very analytical, very organized. And the boards that I serve on all have one characteristic in common, and that is that they agree to set their board meetings a year in advance. So when you do that, calendar planning becomes pretty easy, and you can oftentimes coordinate trips. So it's really not as hard as that may seem to do, but it's a full-time job, so I'm working full-time.
Shifting gears a little bit and getting into some of the subject matter that we are here to talk about today, you have quite a bit of experience working with either first-time or relatively early in their career young CEOs. Can you tell us a little bit about how you like to work with those CEOs and what you expect out of them and what they might expect out of you as a director, specifically related to some of, again, the earlier stage companies and executives that you've had the opportunity to work with?
Well, having both been a CEO of a large company with 20,000 employees and a building company from, as you mentioned, from 35 to 300 employees, I have experience in both how to run a much larger organization, very different management style than running a small organization. And that's one of the reasons that I've been asked to be a board member of a number of these private equity firms. Of the 20 boards that I'm currently on, I'm mentoring 8 or 9 of the CEOs. I'm actually mentoring on a pretty regular basis, and it's one of the reasons that they've asked me to be on the board, to try to provide that personal consulting advice on how to do that. And of those 8 or 9, 5 or 6 of them are first-time CEOs, having not been a CEO before. So the way I like to work with them is just on a very personal basis, where we'll have calls or meetings in person to talk about ideas that come up. And generally, if the person is receptive to mentoring, not all people are, if the person is receptive to mentoring, they'll really want to take that advice, and then sometimes they accept it, sometimes they don't, but either way it helps them think through what their action should be. And so I work on a very personal basis with them.
Sure. My guess is that you've helped some of these first-time and relatively young CEOs through some challenges and mistakes that they've encountered. What are some of the issues and mistakes, if you will, that you most commonly see coming from this set of relatively inexperienced executives?
Yeah, it's management is actually pretty consistent across all companies as to the challenges you face. And so one of the things I try to do in assisting is to look back at my own experiences and the mistakes I made, because there are a number of mistakes that I made. If I had an opportunity to do it again, I would do it in a different way. And I would say that the number one issue I try to focus on with these entrepreneurs in a smaller company setting is to never get ahead of your board. And I found myself in a number of instances in my own career where I thought I had board support, I knew what I wanted to do, and I got a little too far ahead of the board and took the board by surprise. That's a big, big mistake, and probably if there's one issue I would suggest to any first-time CEO, it's that issue. Don't get ahead of your board.
Now, that's great feedback and advice. What are some of the activities and actions that you like to see the CEO make independently versus those that you think are better suited for board involvement? Now, obviously, you, Dennis, and other directors are very busy people, and you work with a number of CEOs. Where do you draw the line of activities and actions that you want to see handled independently or with some degree of board involvement?
Yeah, very good question, and I'll give you two responses to that question. First, with regard to how you think about that and the activities that you would do. The typical young entrepreneur is very focused on his business objective, knows where he wants to go, and that person is generally going to be able to make a lot of decisions on their own based on their own knowledge set. And those might be right decisions, but they may or may not be decisions that are consistent with the board's objectives, particularly if there are private equity money or venture capital money involved, where the objectives are not always fully aligned. So my key recommendation to any CEO in that position is to both always be providing direction to the board, not asking them for a question as to what to do, but at the same time not taking them by surprise. So how do you do that? So step one is if there's a new thing that you're going to do, a potential acquisition, some new product line, you introduce it as an idea to the board by telling them that you're looking at this one or two new ideas. Here's the general thing I'm looking at. I don't have a recommendation yet, but I'm doing research on it. I'm looking at it in advance. That way the board is well aware you're doing what you're doing. And if they have an objection, they can object at that point, which they generally will not do. You then go and do the research and you come to a conclusion that you know what you want to do. You want to acquire a company, start a new product, whatever it might be, and you know your conclusion. You should also come up with options. You should never go to the board with just, this is the plan, we've got to do it. So you say, this is the plan, I think this is the right thing to do, but the alternatives would be to do this, this, and this. I believe that the right direction is the one I've recommended. You present that to the board, and so that you're giving them choices and options, you're giving them a recommendation and just not asking them, what should I do? So they see you as a leader. They see you as providing that affirmative direction that is needed. So very, very simple is no surprises by telling them in advance what you're doing. And then when you come with a recommendation, always have it as a recommendation, not as a question.
Sure, and how much socialization from the CEO to the board happens in advance of the presentation of that particular recommendation or set of options? I mean, is that something that in advance of a quarterly scheduled board meeting, you're having informal meetings with those directors in advance to mitigate the likelihood that there is a surprise in that meeting?
Yes, and there's an old saying, never ask a question unless you know the answer, right? Or never provide a direction unless you know the answer in advance. And there's an element of that. Now, what I find on different boards that I've been involved in, and having been on 50, I've seen an awful lot of examples of this, is that they're very different from board to board. In some instances, you'll have a private equity firm that's a very dominant participant, wants to be involved at a very detailed level. Another might be very strategic. So as the CEO, you need to know the personalities of your board. You have to understand what are the issues that you think they're going to want to look at in more detail, and what are the issues where there's less detail, and then you socialize it with the ones where you think you've got a need to do that before the meeting. It's a very subjective test, but when working with the CEOs, where I'm on the board, oftentimes I'll be the lead director, and so if I'm mentoring the CEO, then I'll say to him, I'll help you socialize this with them and find out, because the CEO may not know and I may not know what they really feel, but it's a little easier for your lead director to do that if the CEO has confidence that that the lead director is going to be working with the CEO on a confidential basis, which I do. So that's it. Now, I'll offer just one additional thought, which is an idea that I came across many, many years ago. It was an idea called the rule of three, which says that in life, there's never more than three things that matter on anything, whether it's business, personal, or anything of that nature. So when you come to the board with a recommendation or a thought, the way that you should present that is to think of what are the three most important concepts that you're going to try to get across. Now, there may be 10 or 20 or 30 concepts you want to present, and the way you do that is you send material in advance with lots of detail in it. But when you come to the meeting, you show your leadership by focusing on just those three items. And you say, today we need to focus on this, this, and this. You go through them in detail, and then you ask for some direction. So the rule of three thing fits very, very well. I also find that it is a very good way of structuring board meetings so that they're well organized and you can get through material on a timely basis.
That's a great segue. So where I'd like to go next is if you have any guidance or opinion on, and I'd ask that you wear your Empower hat a little bit more than your CNA hat here. For that relatively inexperienced and first-time CEO, how should they think about structuring the board from a size standpoint, from a frequency of meeting standpoint? Are there any rules of thumb that you might suggest in a smaller business that maybe don't necessarily apply to a larger publicly traded company that you could give our viewers and listeners today?
Sure, yeah. I have one rule in terms of setting board meeting schedules as to what the philosophy should be, and it's the frequency should equal the period of change. Now, what that means is that if there isn't change, there's no reason to have another meeting. If you have a meeting and nothing has changed, why are you having the next meeting? So before you set the frequency, you have to look at the period of change for a business. So as an example, if it's a marketing business or if it's a manufacturing business, you have to look at what's the time frame over which there will be sufficient change to have another discussion. That might be monthly, it might be quarterly, it's going to vary a lot. For a large public company board, that's going to be more or less quarterly. Not that much changes on a monthly basis to have another director discussion. Interestingly, on smaller companies, the frequency of change, it's a little counterintuitive, but it tends to be more frequent rather than less. And so you tend to have maybe monthly meetings as opposed to quarterly. But it's going to vary a lot by understanding that frequency of change.
Yeah, and I might even propose that an earlier stage company that's going through a period of rapid growth would maybe lend itself to a more regular, call it monthly schedule, as opposed to a smaller business that might be going through a period of gradual growth nonetheless, but a little bit more gradual, playing in a stable and relatively unchanging industry, if you will.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think that each board is different, so you have to look at what is that period of change over which it makes sense for us to have a discussion, and then you set the frequency there. Now, I'll add one additional thing that's very helpful. We all are familiar, of course, being different businesses, with the concept of dashboards and having some form of reporting on some periodic basis. So in addition to setting the frequency of change, frequency of meeting and the period of change for the board meeting, the communication of information should also be set. And so you want to look at what type of information should that director get as a flow outside of the normal conversations. And it can come in the form of an email or a report or whatever. So there are some businesses that I'm involved in where actually the frequency of change is such that I want daily information. And there's others which are quarterly. As an example of a small hotel that I have an ownership interest in, and I want to know the daily occupancy. It's something that's useful to me because I know what's happening with the operations. I want to see the revenue in the comparison to the prior year. So there, I get a very simple little email with 3 or 4 lines on it. That's a standard email. It's generated by the system, so there's no work. So I know the occupancy daily. That's important to me. There are other boards where, frankly, the financial statements and the complexity of the organization and the growth change are such that I don't want to know anything daily or weekly or monthly. I want to know it quarterly. Sure. So you do the 2 things simultaneously. You set your board meeting frequency equal to the period of change, and then you use that same period of change concept in terms of involvement to set the dashboard information.
Sure, that's wonderful feedback and advice, Dennis. So that dashboard, or that set of metrics, if you will, as I like to sometimes define it, how much of that is determined by the CEO and his key deputies on the executive team, and how much involvement and feedback comes from the board as to, hey, these are the types of things that we want to be looking at on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. How have you found the interplay between the executive team on the board when establishing that set of metrics and dashboard?
Yeah, it's a very good question that ties to the concept of KPIs, or key performance indicators. Every company needs to ascertain what its key performance indicators are. Now, you can look at things like its stock price or revenue or something of that nature, but they're going to always be a very small number. The rule of 3 applies here. I generally like no more than 3, which are the key critical performance indicators to tell you whether you're on track or not. And generally, as the CEO, and particularly for a smaller company with an emerging and a new CEO, an emerging company, I like the CEO to come forward to the board with the recommended KPIs. If he goes to the board and says, what should our KPIs be, then they're going to say, well, isn't that your job to tell us? So the CEO should think through, what are the 3 most important things we need to accomplish? What are the ways of measuring those? Go to the board and suggest it. Get the board's concurrence, and then once you do it, you put it into an automated reporting system that gives you that information. And then you use that to tie to your strategic plan.
Yep, and those may evolve over time.
They will change over time, because you get to a certain point and you have a different set of objectives. It's also true that if you look at these emerging companies versus a more established company, and you think about reasons for success or failure, got a very simple little idea that, in fact, is very powerful, which starts with the question of, why do companies fail? Because if you know why they fail, then you can start thinking about, what do I have to do to succeed? And so when you look at the failure of small companies, it's almost never because of inability to manufacture, to get the quality control right, to put the accounting in, to put the controls in, to manage the resources, to get the capital, to hire the people. Those are generally not the reasons for failure. The reason for failure is almost always inability to get revenue. Because if you get the revenue, all the other stuff tends to take care of itself. So the question is, what do I have to do to get revenue? And it's a model that I learned at the very early part of my career from a guy who was a real marketing expert, about defining how to think through sales and marketing and what the role of it is. And it's a very simple model. It's a 3-word model. It says, creating consumers efficiently. Now, on the surface, you'd say, okay, that's a pretty simplistic thing. Who doesn't know that? You've got to create your consumers efficiently. But you can use that as a model to test a business idea to see if you can grow. So the first step is to break that into 3 separate words. And the first word is consumer. What I find when I'm dealing with a young CEO in a new business, I'll ask him the creating consumers efficiently question by saying first, who is your consumer? And I'll oftentimes find that they do not really understand the concept of who your consumer is. Your consumer is not the person that uses the product. Your consumer is the one who signs the check saying they're going to buy the product from you. And oftentimes that person is hard to find because they're buried in the middle of the concrete layer of a corporation, and that's the most difficult thing in a startup company. Now, once you've identified that consumer, you know who he is, you go to the first word, which is create. How do you create that consumer? That consumer doesn't know he needs your product. So you have to find a way to get to that consumer in an effective manner. Once you've understood how to create it, you go to the last word, which is efficiently, and the cost of sales. The cost of sales has to be less than the value of the product generated. So that model is a very good way of testing whether your business idea is going to work, and that's also useful in presenting to your board.
Yeah. So shifting gears a little bit, Dennis, that was super helpful. When taking the executive office as a first-time CEO, relatively inexperienced CEO, I obviously want to surround myself with a lot of Dennises and other folks. How do you think about the ideal composition, whether it be industry experience, operator versus investor experience, those folks that are the directors and the mentors for this CEO? How should a first-time CEO think about that composition and that mix of different skill sets and backgrounds?
Very good question about the mix and composition of the board. The first question is size of board. How large should your board be? I've been involved in companies that have boards as small as 3 people, and one had 34 people. And I will tell you, they're very, very different in terms of management and the things that you do. When you get into larger companies, they typically are managed through committees. So while you have board meetings, they might be quarterly or maybe 5 or 6 times a year, but you're going to do most of the work through committees. When you get into smaller boards, there's generally no need for a committee. I'll give you just some general thoughts, which are my own personal opinion. On public company boards, the number that I like best is in the 7 to 9 range as far as total board members. I think that's the most effective. I've been on boards larger that have functioned well, but I like 7 to 9. On small company boards, the number I like best is in the range of 5. I think that's the best level because you can get things done better and you have the right ability to balance skill set. The second question then that you were asking, which is composition. What do you want? Well, it's going to vary a lot industry to industry, but the kinds of factors to consider are: 1, do you need assistance in capital raising? Or do you have all the capital you need? If you have the capital you need, you probably have a private equity person on the board, so you don't need help in that regard. How about in compliance and regulation? Do you need somebody with compliance and regulatory skills? Some instances, yes. Some instances, it doesn't matter. Another question is whether you need help in marketing. Do you need somebody to help you, particularly in the new advent of digital marketing and with the advent of the internet becoming such an important part of marketing elements? Do you need some critical expertise in that kind of an area? And finally then, in just the general nature of the business that you're in, whether it's financial or manufacturing, do you need somebody with industry experience? It's also helpful to have someone on the board who has governance experience, particularly for a first-time CEO, that can do the type of mentoring that I talked about earlier.
Yeah, great. It's a good segue into the levels of involvement. And you and I, Dennis, have talked about the sort of the spectrum. And you have a very interesting framework that you've referred to, sort of the various, and I believe there's 5, sort of levels of board involvement. And maybe you can take that framework, explain it to our viewers and listeners a little bit, and help us apply that framework to operating in this lower middle market, specifically with businesses that are led by relatively young and inexperienced first-time CEOs.
Yeah, there's one of, I think, the best articles on governance is written by a fellow named David Nadler. And David Nadler wrote an article called Building Better Boards. It was in Harvard Business Review, and you can get copies of it. It was written about approximately 10 years ago. And it's one of the best pieces I've read on it. And in that article, he talks about a number of elements of it, but to your point specifically, he talks about the 5 boards that you and I have discussed. This is his concept, and I think it's very valuable. And he talks about 5 types of boards. This applies small and large. The first type is what you'd call the compliant board, who is there largely to do whatever the CEO wants them to do. Level 2 is the compliance board, which is there to make sure that all the right things happen and that the board is making the decisions it needs to make, that the right things are occurring, it's got integrity in its process, and it's not directed by the CEO like the compliant board. The board that's involved with the compliance activity, in fact, is there to make sure you stay on track. The level 3 is the engaged board. Not only are they doing the compliance and making sure the right things are happening, but they're engaged with the CEO, particularly on strategy. Level 4 is the intervening board, where the CEO is running the company, but the board then every now and then jumps in to do something to help which in my judgment is generally not helpful. And finally, level 5 is the operating board, where the board is the management.
Yep.
And so those 5 boards you will see in virtually all public and private companies. You'll see examples of them across the board. And I believe the most effective is the engaged board, where you're truly using your board for that purpose. So it's important for the first-time CEO to understand what type of board he has and what type of input is he going to get, because typically he's going to have private equity financing, and he needs to know how does he deal with those board types. So it's an article I would recommend our listeners to read. It's a really good article.
One final question before we sort of wrap things up here. How should our viewers and listeners think about compensation at the board level? These are generally small businesses that don't have a tremendous amount of free cash flow generation capability. Ideally, they will in the future have more. How have you thought about compensation at the board level for these small, sort of lower middle market businesses?
Yes, a very good question about the nature of compensation related to the people you have on your board. Now, on the board of a smaller company, generally what you're going to have is somebody who has a very specialized expertise. And why would they join that board? They would join the board because they're interested and believe in the product. They like the interaction with the people on it. Normally, they're not going to be in a full-time job. They may be, depending on the nature of the person, but an awful lot of them are going to be in some state of retirement. Oftentimes is what you find there, where you'll bring in experts who have that background. And the other characteristics of most of the board members in that type of board is that the compensation is not the reason they're doing it. They're doing it because of these other reasons. And generally that's the kind of board member you want, because if they're doing it just for the compensation, it's the wrong person. So knowing that, that person by and large doesn't need cash. That person has cash from other sources. And as a consequence, that person would like to see real alignment of their own efforts with the shareholders. And how do you do that? You compensate them in equity. And there are many forms of equity. We don't have to go into what they are, but you will compensate them in some form of participation in the results of the business. That works best. The level of that compensation, however, even for the company that is reasonably successful, is not going to change the lifestyle of that board member, because they're generally at a wealth level that they're going to be comfortable with. They're at a point in their life where they're not doing this for the compensation, so it doesn't have to be super high. Now, every now and then, when you have a unicorn, or you have one of these companies that goes to incredible levels, it can produce incredible levels of wealth. But by and large, people are doing it because of the interaction that they have with people. And so I like to see just a compensation system that's based non-cash, because you don't want to drain the cash of the company, and based on a participation over some longer period.
Dennis, this has been wildly interesting. I'm sure that all of our viewers and listeners would love to sort of get one final parting sort of piece of advice or word of wisdom from you as they think about embarking on a career in ETA and taking over as a first-time CEO.
Sure. I'd say the first question to think about is your own longer-term personal objectives. And are you truly prepared to take the risk that's attached to doing that? And are you prepared to actually be that type of an entrepreneur versus getting on a corporate track? They lead to very different conclusions, very different results. And so if you're the type of person who wants to be that entrepreneur, then I'd strongly encourage you to do it. And then always remember that first thing that we talked about is never get ahead of your board.
Dennis, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining this edition of the Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition podcast. We'll see you next time.